Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Today, there's a meeting taking place between NATO and the Russia Council, which is meeting in Brussels. And in part, they'll be discussing the INF Treaty, i.e. the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, as many of our viewers may know, on July the 3rd, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into law a bill that essentially suspended Russia's part within the INF Treaty. That was following a decision on February the 1st by the United States, which walked away from the treaty at that time, again alleging Russian violations that had been taking place for a significant amount of time. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Florian Peschl, who is an independent political researcher and journalist, and has specialized knowledge in EU affairs, security and conflict studies, and regional expertise, including Russia as well. He's joining us now from Vienna in Austria. We're also joined by Zlatko, who is an assistant professor at the American University in the Emirates, and he is joining us now on the line from Dubai. Zlatko and Florian, thank you both for joining us. Florian, I'd like to start with you. What do you think will come out of today's meeting between NATO and Russia? The Russians from the beginning had downplayed the importance of this meeting when it came to INF, saying that essentially Putin's decision on suspension would stay.
Yes, I don't expect much to come out of it, especially the relationship between NATO officials and Russian officials has deteriorated over the past years extremely. And as you already said, Putin doesn't expect much either. And I think his plan is to find a new agreement with Trump and to pose himself as somebody who finds solutions, who is looking for solutions. And he offered talks to the US. And I think his plan is really to negotiate something else. He also needs it domestically for his image to improve his image of being somebody working hard for political solutions nationally and internationally.
So then are you saying, Florian, that all of these warnings coming out, and as I'm sure you've seen as well, many of the headlines quite alarmist about what this means for the future and nuclear war, etc. Do you think we're all overstating the danger a bit?
I think we are not overstating the danger of it happening accidentally, because it increases the risk of nuclear conflict over false launch warnings. That's for sure. But I don't think it doesn't increase the risk necessarily at this point of an open declared conflict.
Zlatko, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. In many ways, do you think this may not be a bad thing, where a new treaty, a more all-encompassing treaty, can then be dealt with and negotiated, including other countries?
Well, we are certainly witnessing the falling apart of the previous world order that was established after the Second World War. And I see this treaty as one of those elements of that order, and it is simply outdated, I would say, by inevitability of the process. Obviously, the American administration and the people who are supporting it have entered the process of dismantling of the existing global order, and they are trying to reshuffle it in a different way. And that's what we are witnessing now. So I would say that this treaty had to be abolished or abandoned the way it has been, simply by nature of this very process of dismantling of the previous order. So technically speaking, it brings, this disappearance of the treaty brings more uncertainty, technically speaking, but the point is that they are going to sit down and negotiate a new type of order.
But then in the context, Zlatko, of the Russia collusion allegations against Russia, as you well know, in the 2016 elections in the US, and many other issues which we can talk about, be it Syria, be it Ukraine, or otherwise, that we see this disagreement between the United States and Russia and NATO and Russia, etc. In that context, is this just another sign that these two sides simply do not get along?
Well, obviously, tensions are rising. We cannot deny that. It is simply a matter of political will, whether there is a political will. I don't see a problem, technically speaking, to negotiate all these issues which are a matter of dispute between the two powers. The point is about political will. What is the kind of vision that both sides have in their minds?
Yeah.
In my view, Russia has some kind of stability and trying to expand some kind of Eurasian geopolitical space in which China and Russia would be the dominant powers, but would include others. On the other side, we don't really know what the US wants to create out of it. We are just witnessing the dismantling of the multilateral order and trying to start from scratch, signing bilateral treaties with each and every country. So far, that's what we have been witnessing concerning the US. But it's very difficult to say what is the ultimate vision behind it.
Okay, so Florian, if I may, Florian, your view then on how do you think Europe is viewing all of this? Do you think that Europe is viewing all of this with a bit of worry, or do you think that they're all on that side, as I may say, the NATO side? Or do you think that they're all already united when it comes to this issue of Russia? Because it's not just about, of course, this treaty. As I pointed out to Zlatko, there are many other areas of disagreement between the US and Russia specifically, but then there are then major areas where Europe needs Russia, be it for energy or otherwise.
Yeah, that's a very difficult point. The EU needs the US for its security. There are certain fractions within the European Union. There are more pro-Russian elements. It's also my country, Austria, has very good trade relationships with Russia. But in the end of the day, it's always, when it comes to security, the European Union, as long as we don't have a European army, as long as there are no intelligence services, we are dependent on NATO. But in these days, it's like there are more and more debates about whether NATO in its current form is actually appropriate, whether it's not outdated, whether we are really capable of ensuring whole of Europe's or all of the EU's security with NATO.
Are you saying, Florian? I just want to be clear. Are you saying Russia does pose a threat to the EU?
I wouldn't say no, it doesn't pose an immediate threat. What mostly poses a threat to the EU is our disputes between the US and Russia. It challenges Russian behavior, Russian foreign policy in the past years. When you think about Ukraine, for example, it poses huge challenges because the Putin regime knows what they are doing when they are trying to show the weaknesses of the European Union, and especially when it comes to security, when it comes to fast responses, there are huge weaknesses in the European Union. There are structural problems, and in this case, there is a political threat coming from Russia. Not so far, as long as we have NATO in Europe, not the militaristic threat.
Okay, so I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because again, this sort of fear of Russia and what it may do, and its growing influence, etc., around the world is something that is spoken about quite often. In fact, do you think that it is a bad thing for Russia to be seeking to increase its influence around the world? Do you think it does genuinely pose any form of a threat to anybody?
I don't think so. I mean, I will sound pretty heretic in this, but I think that Russia is simply struggling for its living space, not in terms of Lebensraum necessarily. But, Russia has been under terrible pressure by the United States in the last 2 decades, and Russia is simply trying to return to the global stage.
But then, Zlatko, if I may come in, the immediate example, and I apologize for cutting you off, the immediate example that the Western side would bring up, saying that Russia is a threat, is what Russia has done in East Ukraine. That's quite a huge example, quite a public example, a public display of Russian power, isn't it?
Well, Russia is going to display its own power. It has to reassert itself on the global stage. But I would say this is the right moment for Europe to do something. Europe has two possibilities, either to be totally passive and to simply be, feel threatened by this current development, and it can step in and try to mediate between the two powers and try to develop another vision. So far, we are in a lack of a proper vision of the next world order. We are just witnessing of dismantling of the present or the previous one, as you like it, but there is a lack of clear vision. Now Europe has a great chance being put in between the two powers, having certain degree of trust in the US, which is rare, having also a great deal of trust in Russia, and Europe has a unique chance to try to develop another vision and try to mediate, if you like.
Okay, so Florian, one of the major things that has come up when we're talking about Russia versus US is, if I go back to the INF just for a moment, as the main topic of our discussion, it can be argued that, listen, once the US walked away from it on February the 1st, it picked up its spending on its nuclear arsenal drastically. And even Donald Trump has said that, listen, we now have the best nuclear arsenal in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And then, Putin just recently said, compare how much Russia spends on defense, some $48 billion, versus how much the US spends, which is over $700 billion. So which side really, Florian, is the threat to the other?
This is very hard to tell in this example. I think that some steps Russia did in response were quite pragmatic, at least more pragmatic than we don't really know where the US are going, as Zlatko said. It's hard to tell. Well, if I was in the Russian position, I would of course feel more threatened. Also, when we think back in 2002, when the US withdraw from ABMT, there is a pattern, like over the past 20 years, where Russia has been there has been put pressure on Russia in its direct neighborhood too. So it's a long story, and it's really, and I think the problem is the rhetoric we are using and politicians are using at current times is a Cold War rhetoric, but we are living in new realities, and it's time to change the terminology of our debates too, and to find solutions, and to not treat, for example, Eastern Europe as we would still have the Iron Curtain. We don't. But at the current time, Russia as well as the US have leaders who use terminology that's more from the past century and not appropriate these days.
Okay, we'll leave that as a final word, and I think that's actually a point to end off on. I'll thank Florian and Zlatko for taking their time out and, of course, for sharing their expert insight with us. As Florian there said, viewers, at the end, we need to get out of the Cold War mentality and move towards a contemporary rhetoric and contemporary discussion and negotiations. Both sides, of course, we can argue, as Florian did as well there, have been using this older discussion about the Cold War that happened in the past. But at the same time, the realities are, as Putin said, $48 billion that Russia spends versus $700 billion that the United States spends. NATO expansionism close to Russia's borders. That's, of course, what Russia would perceive as a threat. But then on the other side, then, of course, they would argue that Russia's actions in Ukraine are also threatening, and that Russia, when it came to the INF treaty, did violate it through that missile system which it had created. The Russians, of course, deny that, saying that that does not breach the INF treaty. A lot of those specific details, of course, in military terms are very important when it comes to this treaty, but is it a bad thing? Maybe we can come up with a better treaty now that is more all-encompassing, including other countries as well. We'll keep a close eye on how all of this works out in the coming days, months, and years. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Well, an interesting development happened at the United Nations Security Council. This, of course, after that migrant center had been attacked in Libya. Of course, we know that 44 at the very least had been killed in that attack, which the Libyan UN-led government blamed on Khalifa Haftar. Khalifa Haftar saying, no, we attacked, in fact, a military base or a legitimate target, in that spokesman's words, and that this attack on this Libyan migrant center took place 17 minutes after the original attack of Haftar forces. Now, those details, of course, are still playing out. The blame game is still playing out, but the U.S. blocked at the UNSC a statement of condemnation of what occurred and a call for a ceasefire. That, of course, is a very interesting development. And just today as well, the UN has added on another development saying that Libyan guards at this migrant center, in fact, shot at migrants who were trying to escape as they were under attack. A very interesting development as well. What does all of this mean? Let's discuss this further. We're joined now by Nicholas Mucerino, who is an independent analyst of international affairs. He's joining us now from Prague. We're also joined by Dr. Issam Laaroussi, who is a professor of international law and a senior research fellow at Trends for Research and Advisory. He's joining us now on the line from Abu Dhabi in the UAE. Nicholas and Issam, thank you both for joining us. Nicholas, I'll start with you. What do you make of why it is at the UN that the U.S. would not have wanted this sort of a condemnation and call for a ceasefire to go through? It seems quite logical in such a case, doesn't it?
Well, first off, thank you for having me on today, Waqar. In regard to why the United States might have considered blocking any ceasefire measure related to the ongoing hostilities in Libya, if we go back a few months, we had that call between General Khalifa Haftar and President Donald Trump, which was unprecedented for an American president at that point. When it came to the general, he had no success reaching out to the previous administration because he was viewed as a pariah and a threat to solving the situation rather than a part and a solution. Whereas President Trump, he hailed General Haftar as a counterterrorism force, commending him for his role in getting rid of ISIS fighters in the country, and essentially turning a whole 180 degrees from the previous Obama administration. Yeah. So far, administration statements haven't really. The administration itself hasn't been directly involved when it has come to Libya in comparison to the Europeans, the Middle Eastern allies, or Russia. But this could be a sign that the U.S. is considering hedging its bets, or considering placing more emphasis on the role Haftar could play in any resolution.
Okay, so Issam, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. It's interesting, isn't it, that the UN itself backs the Libyan government, the official Libyan government, at this point in time, but yet it is at the UN itself where it seems that there isn't even enough support really for that government to be able to function and to ensure security and stability in the country. Why do you think that is?
Basically, we can discuss this point from the first option that the UN is not giving a large support to the government, to the official government in Libya, the government of national accord, which means this process has been in several times disturbed and not being very good supported by the United Nations, especially this document and this holding the American veto is always stopping, and also some international alliances like United States and Russia are all making a large distance between the problem, between the crisis in Libya. We have to share this point of view, which is United Nations is in a weak situation. It has not the ability to stop this war. This war is, frankly, is entirely the war of superpowers and regional powers. The United States, in the first step, supported General Khalifa Haftar just doing well and to be the strongest man in Libya to beg and or to reconciliate the whole Libya and to govern again from the military point of view, and also backed by original support like France and also Saudi Arabia. So that's mean that this big game is not dependent, it's not referring to UN decisions. And also United States, meanwhile, has kept its distance from the Libya, finances the murder of its ambassador in Benghazi in September 2012. Instead, Washington's interest has largely been limited to a very sporadic fight against terrorist groups in the Maghreb and the Sahel. That's why the UN decisions are a little bit skeptical, a little bit far off solving and resolving the problem in Libya war.
Okay, so, one of the interesting aspects here, Nicholas, is that, we can, of course, a lot about the fact what's happened in Libya ever since the fall of Gaddafi. And, continuous chaos really is probably the best way to describe it. But then this has had very real-world repercussions for the rest of the world, not just for Northern Africa and for surrounding countries within Africa, of course, but then for Europe as well, because all of these migrants entering into Libya then obviously want to get to Europe, and that's that's the sort of migrant center that had been hit then. But I was watching an interesting report today about how Libyan government officials are now saying, listen, we're dealing with not only chaos within our country, but now we're dealing with all of these foreigners coming into our country who want to then get to Europe. Europe is blocking them. What on earth are we supposed to do? The world keeps holding us to account, but is not really helping us. What do you make of that situation, Nicholas?
What I personally make of the situation is that the concerned parties, whether it be in the West or in the Middle East, they're not entirely sure what to make of Libya right now, because as you mentioned the European Union. Primarily, the EU tried to take the side of the Sarraj government, the government of national accords, which is recognized by the United Nations in Tripoli. But then several months ago, you had a big disagreement within the European Parliament when trying to pass a resolution condemning Khalifa Haftar's assault on Tripoli. Yeah. But it had to be watered down at the request of France, Italy, who deems itself very much at risk of new migration, considering its proximity to Libya, condemned France and accused them of double dealing with Haftar at that point. We have seen France try to reapproach the government in Tripoli recently by offering limited security cooperation, but they seem to be hedging their bets at the same time through backing Haftar with allegedly arms or intelligence. But then, in addition to Europe, Libya is becoming another proxy battleground. For example, Haftar is backed by General Sisi in Egypt, which actually ties back into your previous question relating to the U.S. role, where the administration itself has been rather divided on creating a more comprehensive approach to Libya.
Point, Nicholas, because it's an important point you raised, but I want, if I may, just from the point of view of the other side, then if we're talking about the Gulf countries and others who are looking at Haftar possibly, if we enter into that discussion, do you not think that in some ways that a lot of these countries may be viewing Haftar as a strong man who can actually bring some stability to the country, which clearly the UN government has, the UN-led government, I should say, UN-supported government, actually, more accurately, has not been able to bring into the country? Maybe Haftar can be the man who can actually stabilize Libya.
You're exactly on the dot in describing, as well as the Egyptian position when it comes to Haftar. They view him as another military man, almost in the same mold as General Sisi or the military council that they're currently backing in Sudan. And Haftar is particularly more palatable to the Gulf monarchies because the opposition, the government in Tripoli, is backed by forces that they deemed aligned with Islamist factions, primarily those connected to the Muslim Brotherhood or Turkey and Qatar. And that's why we've also seen both Turkey as well as Qatar, sending arms to the GNA when Tripoli was in danger by Haftar's forces just last month. And the LNA repeatedly makes claims about shooting down Turkish-supplied drones and Turkish operatives and ships supplying military arms to Tripoli.
Issam, I wanted to get your thoughts on that because you are in the UAE. So just give us their point of view from where you're sitting right now. I imagine everybody wants stability, right? So it's no different, is it, for the Saudis or the UAE or others? They want stability in Libya because so much chaos over so many years has not been good for any of these countries, has it?
Yeah, for sure. Frankly, all the actors, I think, all the regional actors, international actors, are seeking for stability, are seeking for secure area, are seeking for a new Libya, productive new environment which is based on stability and peace and also prosperity for Libyan people. In a way, I think this is a very deep discussion. Because it's true that your intervener is mentioning that this is a big game between two sides of blocks. One, when the international position is divided actually between two sides. One supporting and thinking seriously that Haftar is the strongest man and he can govern and he can unify whole Libya, and the other side is not thinking the same way, and thinking that this side is also struggling the Islamic factions. But finally, I think that the rule of the United States is it have been a lot of shortcomings of this rule. Before, I think the U.S. rule could be still determinant and reversing Libya outfall downward spiral. The United States could have an important diplomatic function on two fronts, to coordinate and balance the different external actors, and also to help and mediate between the main internal actors, namely the Tripoli-based government of national accord and Tobruk-based House of Representatives.
Okay, we'll leave there as our final word then, Issam. I do apologize for cutting you off. The clock has gotten about. But of course, we appreciate both of your time, your insight and analysis. That was Nicholas and Issam. Nicholas speaking to us from Prague, and Issam was speaking to us there from Abu Dhabi. Viewers, as we spoke about, there are conflicting interests. No one can really deny that when it comes to Libya. What are the U.S. interests, though? Because it certainly stood out at the UN Security Council when it didn't support even just a basic condemnation of this attack and call for a ceasefire, which, again, as I said at the beginning, sounds like the most logical thing to be doing at this point in time in a country as chaotic as Libya since the fall of Gaddafi. Again, these conflicting interests need to sit down somehow and need to come to some sort of solution which stabilizes the country. And if there are countries that are seeing Haftar as a stabilizing factor, that needs to be discussed too. Is he possibly the one to stabilize Libya, We'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our final segment after this break. Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and you're watching, of course, Scope, and we're coming back right now from our break there in our final segment. And this, of course, about the stolen artifacts that France has just returned, 400 of them, in fact, to the government of Pakistan. This, of course, occurred on Tuesday, included many such artifacts which date back to the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. What this brings up, and it's an important issue, of course, that isn't discussed enough, I feel at least, is that of how such artifacts are stolen from many countries around the world and have been stolen over literally centuries, really. And especially, of course, since the time of colonialism, be it on the part of the British or French or otherwise. And we can talk about many examples out of Africa, out of the Middle East region, and otherwise we, of course, had that cylinder, essentially, which was the first human rights convention written by Cyrus the Great, that Persian king, which was borrowed back to Iran by the British. And again, that, of course, sends a message in and of itself, doesn't it, politically and otherwise, to the world. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Hannan Hussain, who is a policy analyst. He writes for The Diplomat and is also with the London School of Economics, South Asia. He's joining us now from our studios in Islamabad, the Pakistani capital. We're also joined by Rozan Ahmed, who is a cultural strategist. She's a writer, humanitarian, and is also the founder of At Sudan, At Africanism, and At the Magic Drive. And she's joining us now on the line from Dubai. Rozan and Hannan, thank you both for joining us and for your time today discussing this important topic. Hannan, what do you make of the French, to their credit, of course, for giving back these artifacts? How important is this?
I think it is significant. 445 artifacts in total, and then, of course, ranging as far as the diversity of their ancient value goes. I think what is important to note at this time is that the French government has a lot to do with the timing, which goes beyond just an exchange of artifacts. We see that the French military officials have pushed for closer, military cooperation with the Pakistan Army, and I think that sends a good message because this activation of cultural avenues to push for congenial ties is something that has taken on a new dimension between these two countries. But as you've pointed out before as well, I mean, the theft of these artifacts going back centuries and then being confiscated has a lot to do with the Paris Customs interception in 2006, which led the National Center for Scientific Research to kind of trace their trace back to Pakistan. So I think this sets a good precedent for other European countries where many of these artifacts from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa concentrated to basically integrate this as part of their foreign policy and, of course, let indigenous roots prevail.
Rozan, it's interesting because as I was doing research for this show, and you may probably this already, but there is in fact a UNESCO 1970 convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transport of ownership of cultural property. That's an international treaty, of course. For our viewers' sake, that's an important, I think, point to make, that does exist, but it seems Rozan, that even within the context of Africa and other countries, continents and countries, of course, that has not been respected really by many European countries, by many of these colonial powers. What do you make of that?
Well, yes, you are right. However, it is a little too late. And like you said, there is the establishment for it, but the practice of it is a different story. As a Sudanese woman, I believe that we as a people have also been a little negligent of our cultural property, our ancient values, and the artifacts that exist today. And that is essentially because there hasn't been enough education around cultural power. As a believer in words, a big believer in words, I use writing as literally my form of weaponry, so to speak. The word soft power and its relationship to culture is something that we have been taught, that culture is somehow softer as a power, when it isn't at all. And I feel that it's because of that this blatant extortion and let's call it what it is, theft is allowed to take place. And and colonial powers, as it were, are able to this day get away with it.
So, Rozan, on that point you just made, if I may, and I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but do you not think that some of the fact that we may in this region not know as much of our culture in the sense of these archaeological sites, et cetera, these artifacts, do you not think some of that blame should go back, in fact, to the fact that many of us were colonized at some point in time or the other, and that the colonizers would then obviously discourage us from remembering and or keeping memories of such things?
It's a mindset, and my work to this day is my work at the moment since the start of my career has been dedicated to shifting mindsets. The hardest thing to change is a mind, and it's about removing these colonized ideas that have been embedded into our systems and engineered into our thinking spaces throughout time to bring a new understanding. And again, speaking as a Sudanese woman, the renaissance ongoing right now through arts and culture, through self-expression, goes back to cultural appreciation of who we were pre these times of not just physical colonizing, but mental colonizing.
Hannan, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because that's a point, isn't it, where a lot of the times in these contemporary day and age, we do, even possibly in this country or others, we do tend to overlook the importance of culture, archaeology, these sites, these artifacts, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do. Across cultures, that's a similarity that you could kind of identify. Even if you look at, for example, Iran, it has been a proactive approach from the government that has led them to kind of get hold of 1,540 artifacts in the past 10 years from 4 different countries, the United States, United Kingdom, Belgium, and the UAE. But we don't see that kind of a devotion towards remembering their roots be promised by their colonial partners. It's interesting that you raise up the point. One of the points of dispute between this, and one reason why cultural legislation, if any to be, would never really be binding among all these countries as far as repatriation goes, is because many of these museums that are kind of home to these artifacts, let's talk about the Louvre or the British Museum, were kind of erected at a time when nations were at the peak of their colonial or imperial influences. And at that time, to kind of put forth a claim of nation-state territorial acknowledgement of those very artifacts, for example, if Pakistan demands them, or if Iran and Iraq in the past, Syria is a good example as well, demands them, that's basically based on a nation-state's quest to find its identity based on those artifacts. But the argument put forth is that because it was a very product of a colonial setup, these nation-state qualifications don't really add up. And I think at the time when President Macron had basically announced 26 very key artifacts to be returned to Benin in Africa, you really do see a discord between the kind of influence that museums in the West kind of practice upon policy positions in their country. For example, the director of the British Museum is on record to the Times saying that the position of Macron does not exactly represent that of Britain, does not change our policies of museums, and all across Europe as well. So level of resistance is always evident, and this kind of plays into the hands of your question that indigenous countries trying to remember their roots or be true to their historical values is greatly stifled.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Rozan, because certainly, and I'm glad to have the example of the British Museum, because the British Museum's director has been quoted as saying that, listen, we don't care what these countries really want, and I'm of course paraphrasing, but the important quote is that these collections from wherever in the world they may be them from Africa or be they from the Middle East, need to be preserved as whole. And then the other issue which comes up a lot of these times when it comes to these countries wanting their artifacts back is that many of these Western museums will say, listen, you don't have the infrastructure in place, you don't have the ability really to even take care of many of these artifacts. So what do you make of that argument?
That's an interesting point. And to be honest, culture and history resides, we need to consider the emotional aspect that comes into play with this. And, we can talk about policies and infrastructure and all sorts, but a lot of these artifacts we speak of, particularly, you mentioned the British Museum, there's a lot of spiritual artifacts that exist there. And again, as someone who is from Sudan and Kemet, the artifacts currently in the British Museum shown, I believe they're still on display, are directly from my country. And they hold great spiritual value as well as financial value to these museums abroad and whatnot. So whether or not we are capable of sustaining their position, which quite frankly is not for the British Museum or anybody outside of our country to speak on or have an opinion on, regardless of that, it is our duty to look after and spiritually respect our ancestors. It's just from a very basic perspective, the fact that the bodies, the spiritual representations of our ancestors are sitting in glass windows abroad, in glass boxes abroad, is already a defamation. It already makes no sense. So removing, physical, political, philosophical ideas around how one should sustain, an artifact from our past, it doesn't matter. We should be looking at what needs to be done in order for us to get our artifacts back, and then establish ideas around infrastructure. But first of all, give it back.
Yeah. And Hannan, to credit, and again, I don't want to give Macron too much credit, but to his credit, he did, act upon that report that came out, that 108-page report that he had commissioned, the French government commissioned, about these artifacts and about returning them to their respective countries of origin. Do you think that now that this will then be the Pandora's box that is now opened, and then other countries will now be held to account, such as the British and others, and then this sort of will add pressure? Or do you think that this will just be the one-off sort of example, and that may very well be a closed door then?
I think for now it'll be a one-off example in all practicality. It'll be a reference point, of course, for a lot of countries to kind of build their case on, and has kind of opened the window for some level of consensus to be brought about if nations want to do it. But that's entirely voluntary on behalf of other European countries as well that house these artifacts. I think the more important point over here is that despite France being the most receptive out of all the countries that we see, the role of the United Nations Education and Cultural Committees is absolutely paramount in underlining the merits of returning these artifacts to indigenous countries. We have seen UNESCO kind of underline, for example, in the past decade in Syria, out of all the looting and damaging across in Raqqa and Aleppo has basically been attributed to a war aspect as well that has provided a cover for these organized criminal trafficking gangs to kind of prevail, and ISIS, of course. But then, of course, when you look at these things from that dimension, it is really, really important that despite the government of Syria kind of pushing upon museums in France and Italy across as well to kind of build that consensus, we don't really see that happening. So for UNESCO, I think for them to underline, the director to say, quote unquote, that the looting of ISIS in a nation like Syria and what we saw in the Arab Springs in Egypt as well is on an industrial scale. That being said, I think not a lot of emphasis has been made by the same committee to kind of underline the merits of returning these artifacts to indigenous countries and helping them realize the historical footprint, especially when majority of the Western countries, of course, house all the artifacts, a majority of them that kind of speak for their own history. I think it's time that legal force needs to be brought behind all countries that wish to do the same for their native lands.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave there as a final comment, but of course appreciate both Hannan and Rozan for their time and of course their expert insight into this very important issue. Hannan was speaking to us there from Islamabad, and Rozan was speaking to us on the line from Dubai. This is an interesting topic, and it doesn't, I feel personally, doesn't get spoken of enough. And that is, of course, about the colonial past and the theft of these artifacts and archaeological sites, et cetera, et cetera. And this continues really till today. Where a lot of these museums around the world, actually, where a lot of us, aim to visit, are actually filled with items from our very own countries. So imagine if our very own countries were hosting their very own items, the people would be coming this way instead. And what would those countries' museums then look like? How empty would they be? But they're filled right now with essentially stolen items. Most of them, or all of them, in fact, it can be argued as well at some level. So we'll keep a very close eye on how the situation works out. Will France be the only example of returning these artifacts? That's an important point to keep in mind at this point. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.